This past growing season has been the second year that I've done these large trials that involve growing potato plants in large grow bags filled with different types of growing medium and using different types of fertility amendments. One of these trials involved filling a lot of these bags with a compost that's available from one of the main suppliers in the area, which is quite similar to the municipal compost that you can get in a lot of other regions. This compost is clean, weed-free, and convenient to use, but it's not very fertile as it's made with a lot of woody material. And I've been using potato plants to test different ways to amend this compost in order to try to improve it. I've made other videos about this trial, including some last year and one this summer when the plants were still growing. But now that I've harvested all the potatoes from all of these bags, I can confirm that it's still not a very fertile growing medium, except when I add a lot of soluble fertility, especially a lot of nitrogen. We got a large delivery of this compost in early 2021, and most of it remained undercover for a full year. We filled a lot of large grow bags with this compost last spring and grew potato plants in them during the summer. But then these bags full of compost were left outside and exposed over the full winter. Earlier this year, I consolidated a lot of the bags as the volume of the compost had been shrinking, and in the process I found a lot of worms, which was a good sign of healthy decomposition. I dropped some of the options, but continued with 9 amendment variations from last year, continuing with the 2-year-old compost to see how it had changed. And I added 3 other variations based on a fresh delivery of compost from the same supplier. We consolidated all of these bags into a double line in one space with 5 sets of 12 different variations of amendments, or 60 bags in total. A lot of the different variations were amended with additional sources of fertility at the beginning of the season, including concentrated fertility, rock dusts, and other forms of imported materials. I watered all of the bags with a compost tea or a compost slurry that was made up of different forms of biologically active compost and decomposed wood chip, as I wanted to make sure that the useful biology was in the compost of each bag. I then planted all the bags with the same variety of new potato that we used last year, planting 2 seed potatoes in each bag. I then installed a dripper watering system to reduce the work of watering and potential water stress, as I suspect that this was a variable that caused some issues with last year's trial. There were obvious differences in the health of the plants early on, and I was quite disappointed by the growth of some, but others were much stronger and grew for much longer, and I decided to wait until all of the growth had died back before I harvested from any of them. Once again, I was quite disappointed with the overall results, as there was a lot of small potatoes for a lot of work, but I needed to remind myself that this was a trial to see how I could improve poor quality compost. I wasn't trying to grow the best crop of potatoes. And in a trial like this, poor results are good because there can be a lot to learn from them, but I was hoping for a better harvest. Compared to the results from last year, 6 of the amendment options had a slight increase in the weight of the potatoes that was able to be harvested from each of the 5 bags, which was less than I was hoping for, but at least it's something. This small general increase could be due to better weather conditions or the timing of planting, or it could be simply due to more consistent watering. But 2 of the amendment options produced less well this year than they did last year, and neither of them had additional nitrogen added. And when combined with the 2 other options that didn't have any additional nitrogen, all 4 of them were consistently low in their harvest both last year and this year. One option based on the 2-year-old compost did a lot better, the one where a fair amount of soluble conventional fertilizer had been added, and it produced 40% more potatoes this year than it did last year. And these bags produced almost twice the weight of potatoes compared to the bags without any nitrogen added, which is a significant increase based simply on adding a little bit of granular fertilizer at the beginning of the season and then topping it up a few times while the plants were growing. So in the second year of growing in this same compost, there was only marginal increase from last year, except for with the granular fertilizer, and I think that might be because I simply added a lot more of it. The better watering systems and inoculating the compost with biology didn't seem to make any significant difference, but of course there could be other things going on. The plants that were regularly fed with a general liquid feed or dilute urine did produce significantly more potatoes. I think this was probably because I was regularly adding additional amounts of nitrogen and other nutrients in a soluble form that could be quickly converted by the biology in the compost into something that the plants could absorb. And this is essentially the same with the granular conventional fertilizer, which quickly dissolves in the moisture of the compost to become a similar form of soluble available nutrients. So all three of the amendment options that did the best with the 2-year-old compost were all regularly fed with something that contained a soluble form of nitrogen. And the differences between them could be related to the amount of nitrogen that was added, how frequently it was added, or it could be due to the additional phosphorus and potassium that was included. This year, I thought it would be interesting to compare the 2-year-old compost with a fresh batch of compost from the same supplier. So I got a fresh supply delivered, which I divided into 3 separate batches that I amended in 3 different ways, and then allowed this compost to develop and mature for more than a month before using it to fill large grow bags and planting the potatoes. With one batch of this fresh municipal compost, I thoroughly watered it with a biologically active compost tea or compost slurry, and I even added in a couple of handfuls of worms that I'd picked out of another compost pile, as I was hoping to diversify and restart the biological activity and decomposition in this compost, hoping that would help. The potato plants growing in this compost produced really poor yields, the worst out of the whole trial, and it seems that this compost just was not able to release enough nutrients for the growing plants, even with all that biology. With the second batch of compost, I inoculated it with biology using the similar compost tea before mixing in a wide range of concentrated amendments. This included a lot of nitrogen, some bone meal for phosphorus, some sulfur, some seaweed meal, and other trace elements. A lot more than what would be needed to grow the plants themselves, as I was trying to inoculate the compost. This produced a much better harvest of potatoes, with the plants seeming to benefit from the added nutrients that were either missing or out of balance in the compost. With the third batch, I added the same biology and then mixed in a lot of undiluted urine, as I was trying to supercharge this compost with lots of nitrogen before the season started, and then added some more dilute nitrogen to water the plants while they were growing. This produced a much bigger crop of potatoes that was on par with what I was able to harvest out of the bags of older compost that I had regularly liquid fed with something that was high in nitrogen. So this front loading with nitrogen and other nutrients worked. But it is interesting that the actual amount of nitrogen added to the compost with the urine was substantially less than the amount of nitrogen that would have been added with the concentrated amendments in the other batch that was mixed in at the beginning of the season. So it seems that it's not just about the amount of nitrogen that was added, but the form the nitrogen was in and when it was added to the compost. It seems that the nitrogen added at the beginning of the season was not necessarily available to the plants, even if I added loads to begin with. It seems that a lot of it was just absorbed by the compost. The growth of the potato plants and the amount of the potatoes that were produced seemed to benefit from a soluble nitrogen fertilizer, especially if it was added while the plants were growing. This municipal compost material seems to still have too much carbon, or the carbon to nitrogen ratio is too high, even with the 2-year-old compost, which is quite disappointing. I would have thought that this would have decomposed enough by now to have lowered the carbon to nitrogen ratio to something closer to 10:1, so that a lot more nitrogen might be available to the plants. But I'm not sure if this is something that is happening or if this is something that I should even expect. I realized that the plants would be pulling nitrogen out of the compost, and this would be removed from the bags when I harvested the potatoes, which would raise the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and with less nitrogen there is potentially slower decomposition, but I think this would only affect things a bit. I now suspect that rain was a big factor, and possibly too much watering at times, both of which could have washed a lot of the nitrogen out of the compost. These bags of compost were left outside over winter, and all the rain that we had would have dissolved some of the nitrogen or picked up some soluble nitrogen as it passed through the compost and flushed it out of the bottom of the bag. And this would have happened at a time when there is very little biological activity in the compost because of the colder weather. So if this is the case, the compost started the season without enough nitrogen and possibly other nutrients. And this is something that I didn't take into consideration with this large trial in grow bags. I need to remember that the purpose of this trial was to figure out different strategies for amending or improving this low fertility compost, not to figure out the best way to grow potatoes in material like this. The difference in the amount of potatoes that I was able to harvest from the fresh batch of compost once it was amended shows that it can definitely be improved, and perhaps fairly easily. I'm still not sure what the best approach is, but adding a lot more nitrogen definitely seems to help. And an easy solution would be to buy and mix in a lot of granular urea fertilizer, and adding a lot of urine seems to work as well. But I think it really depends on what I want to use this municipal compost for. If I wanted to use it as a low fertility mulch in an established no-dig garden that already had really good fertile soil, then using this municipal compost as it was delivered is probably okay. But if I was using it to start a no-dig garden from scratch, I think investing in a fair amount of concentrated nitrogen to mix in at the start would help produce better growth in the first year or two. And mixing in other amendments as well to round out the fertility in the compost would probably also help. And I think this is essential if I want to dig this type of a municipal compost into the garden soil, or to use it in grow bags to grow plants directly, or to use it to fill raised beds. When I'm buying in municipal compost like this, I need to remember that I'm mostly buying carbon, even if there are other nutrients locked up in it. And if I'm buying the compost for that carbon, then I might as well buy in some other fertility to improve it as well. I think it's also good to regularly feed any plants growing in this type of compost with a dilute urine or weed tea or some other form of fertility that contains soluble nitrogen. The other option is to get in this municipal compost well in advance and let it mature for at least a year, so long as it is kept moist but covered from excess rain that might wash out some of the nutrients. But I'm not sure how necessary this is if you can add enough nitrogen in soluble form. I have learned a lot from this trial, including giving me an indication about how much nitrogen I need to add to municipal compost like this if I want to grow plants in it. But that's when I want to grow in a bag filled with compost like this. And there could be very different things going on if I use it as a mulch on top of the soil or dig it into the soil. And that's part of the limitations of a pot trial like this, where the experimentation is done away from the mineral soil itself. I'm planning to continue to grow with the same batch of compost again next year, but I'm probably going to shift away from the main focus of the trial that I've had for the last 2 years. I'm tired of not getting a good crop out of this experiment, so I'm planning to liquid feed all of the bags on a regular basis with something that is high in nitrogen, in addition to the other forms of amendments. I'm also planning to cover the bags over the winter to keep the rain out, to prevent even more of the nutrients from being flushed away, or I might simply just bring them into one of my polytunnels. I hope this will help to start the growing season with compost that is not depleted of available nutrients, so the plants have a better chance of getting what they need. I want to see what I can do to get a significantly better crop overall next year, to shift away from a trial that is focused on amending compost to a trial that is focused on trying to get the most out of grow bags like this. I have been enjoying this trial over the last 2 years, as well as the larger trial that is based on different types of growing medium and soil amendments. These trials have allowed me to learn a lot in a more controlled setting, with a sample size that is large enough to be able to provide reasonably reliable observations. They are not carefully controlled experiments to test hypotheses or to provide answers, but they're good enough to test general approaches that might be useful in the gardens. These trials have allowed me to learn and to raise a lot of questions and to explore and to share with all of you through this YouTube channel, which is the best part about this Red Gardens project. But these trials are a lot of work, and if you want to support this work and have the spare resources to be able to help me with all these trials and all the other explorations that are part of this Red Gardens project, there are links to my Patreon and PayPal account in the video description. Sharing and commenting, liking and subscribing are also great ways to support this work and to encourage me to continue. But simply watching this video and the other videos on my channel is perhaps the most important form of support. So thank you for watching.
This one had really big. That one that's shot out. Okay, so we'll do a second. It depends, you might want to, seems like quite a lot of roots in there.
Yeah, we might as well sieve them out.